The smell was the first thing. Shen Yao had expected to smell
Liz.
nothing. In the last coherent seconds of her previous life, she had been in the back of a taxi on a January night in Chengdu, the kind of cold that does not ask permission, and the smell then had been cigarette residue soaked into cracked pleather and the faint chemical bite of the air freshener the driver had clipped to his vent. She remembered thinking, with the clarity that arrives only when everything else has been stripped away, that it was a strange thing to notice. She had nothing left. No apartment, no job, no case. And still her brain had cataloged the smell of cheap pine. The smell now was antiseptic, sharp and familiar in the way of institutional spaces, hospitals and government offices, and the back rooms of funeral homes. It arrived before vision did, before the full weight of her own body settled back into her awareness. And it told her something important before she could form a conscious thought. She was not dead. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of Renhe Hospital, District 3, Chengdu, water stain in the upper left corner shaped like a spreading bruise. She knew that stain. She had stared at it for 3 days following the appendectomy she'd had at 23, 2 months before Jiang Mingze had first introduced himself at the Yue Hai Group Charity Gala. She knew the precise angle of the afternoon light through the narrow window, the way it fell in a stripe across the linoleum floor. She knew the weight of the hospital blanket, too thin and too stiff, the particular texture of institutional cotton against the backs of her forearms. She was 23 years old. She lay completely still for a long time, not from shock. She had no room for shock. What she felt instead was something she could not name immediately. Something that required several minutes of careful internal excavation before she understood it. It was the sensation of having an enormous amount of time. In her previous life, she'd spent every year after the age of 28 in a state of managed emergency. Legal fees, counterfilings, depositions that went nowhere, a divorce that stretched over 2 years and consumed everything she had built, including the 8 years she had given to a man who had spent the last 4 of those 8 years giving himself to someone else. She had been reactive for a decade, always one step behind, always answering someone else's move. She would not be reactive again. Shen Yao turned her head on the pillow and looked at the small window. The light was October. That meant the appendectomy. That meant Jiang Mingze would appear in 42 days at the Yue Hai Charity Gala, carrying a glass of Bordeaux she had not asked for, and a smile she had found beautiful for 6 years before she understood it was practiced. She had exactly 42 days before the narrative of her previous life resumed around her, like a river that had been waiting. She spent 20 minutes cataloging everything she remembered. Jiang Mingze, second son of the Jiang Group's founding family. His older brother, Jiang Manhwa, had died in a boating incident 5 years prior to Shen Yao's first death, leaving Mingze as the sole heir. The Jiang Group operated primarily in commercial real estate and private equity across Sichuan and Yunnan provinces. Publicly valued at approximately 4.2 billion RMB at the time of Shen Yao's first marriage in the year she was 24. Privately, she had come to understand through the wreckage of her divorce, considerably more complex. There were holding companies, there were shell entities in Hong Kong and one in Singapore. There were assets that appeared on no balance sheet she had ever been shown. His mother, Jiang Yulan, known in social circles as Madame Jiang, 61 years old when Shen Yao had married into the family. Elegant in the way of women who have spent decades performing elegance until it became structural, part of how they held their shoulders, their spines, the precise degree to which they tilted their chins during conversation. Shen Yao had loved her. That was the part that had taken the longest to metabolize in her previous life. Not the betrayal of Mingze, which had been ordinary in the way that marital betrayals often are, predictable in its vanity and its cowardice. The wound that had not closed was Madame Jiang, because Madame Jiang had been kind to her. That had been the architecture of it Shen Yao now understood. The kindness was not incidental. It was structural. Madame Jiang had needed a daughter-in-law who was capable and presentable, and without a powerful family of her own, someone whose loyalties could be installed rather than inherited. Shen Yao had been an orphan by 21, both parents gone in the same car accident on the expressway outside Lishan. She had a paternal aunt in Guangzhou who sent WeChat messages on her birthday. She had a small apartment she rented in the Jinjiang district. She had a position as a junior financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm. She had been, in the language of the Jiang family's calculations, available. Madame Jiang had performed maternal warmth with considerable skill. She had sent soup when Shen Yao was sick. She had involved her in decisions about the house, small ones at first, and then larger ones, in a gradual expansion of belonging that Shen Yao had experienced as love. When Madame Jiang's own health had begun to deteriorate, in the 3rd year of the marriage, she had held Shen Yao's hand in the hospital and said, "You are the only daughter I have ever approved of." And Shen Yao had cried in the corridor afterward. The jewelry collection had come in year 4. Madame Jiang had called her to her private sitting room, a room Shen Yao had only been invited into 3 times before. The velvet-lined case was already open on the low table. 41 pieces. Shen Yao remembered the count because she had counted them twice. Pendants and brooches and earrings and 3 necklaces and a bracelet set that Madame Jiang had said came from her own mother. There was one ring Shen Yao had particularly loved, a wide oval setting with a deep green stone she had been told was natural emerald, cut in an antique style that made it look like something from a photograph of a different era. "This is yours now," Madame Jiang had said. "A woman should have something that belongs only to her." Shen Yao had accepted it. So she had framed it privately as the most meaningful thing she owned. In the desolation of the years that followed, in the rented rooms after the divorce and the legal bills and the final hearing where a judge had ruled that the jewelry collection constituted a marital asset because it had been transferred to Shen Yao during the marriage, she had returned to the memory of that afternoon with something close to grief. Not for the jewelry, for the version of herself who had believed it. The appraiser who had assessed the collection during the divorce proceedings had placed its value at 28.4 million RMB. Shen Yao had been ordered to either return the collection to the marital estate or compensate Jiang Mingzi for half its assessed value. She had no 14.2 million RMB. She had surrendered the collection. She had walked out of that courtroom carrying the particular weight of someone who has just handed over a decade and received nothing in return. She was 23 years old. She had 42 days. She got out of the hospital bed and pressed the call button for the nurse. The preparation took most of the 42 days. It required that she think of herself as a professional before anything else. Before Shen Yao the woman, before Shen Yao the eventual wife, before even Shen Yao the aggrieved. She needed to be Shen Yao the financial analyst, working a problem with the patient methodology of someone who has seen how fast sentiment can cost you. She started with the public record. The Jiang Group's filings were available through the National Enterprise Credit Information Publicity System. Shen Yao spent 3 evenings in the Jinjiang Public Library, a building that smelled of dust and the slight dampness of old paper, working through everything that was publicly accessible. The filings were clean on the surface. They always were. But Shen Yao had worked in finance long enough to understand that cleanliness in a public filing is not evidence of cleanliness in the underlying structure. It is evidence of a good compliance team. What she was looking for was not available through public filings. What she needed was a baseline understanding of the structure so that when she was inside it, she would be able to identify the anomalies. She also spent 4 days in the Sichuan Provincial Land Registry archives, requesting historical records of property transfers under the Jiang family name and a list of related entities she had memorized from the divorce proceedings in her previous life. The archival staff was unhelpful in the practiced way of government archival staff, slow without being actively obstructive, processing her requests on a timeline calibrated to their own convenience. She was patient. She had always been good at patience when the outcome was clear. She found 3 properties that had been transferred to entities she recognized from her previous life's research as Jiang Group holding companies in transactions dated within the past 18 months. The transfer values were below market, significantly below. One property in Chengdu's Qingyang district, a commercial building assessed at approximately 68 million RMB, had been transferred for 31 million. Another in Kunming, assessed at 44 million, had been transferred for 19 million. This was not unusual in Chinese commercial real estate at the time. Undervaluation in related party transfers was widespread. What made it interesting to Shen Yao was not the practice itself, but the destination of the assets. The receiving entities were not Jiang Group operating subsidiaries. They were holding companies incorporated in the late 1990s during a period when domestic incorporation practices were less rigorous. The beneficial ownership of those entities was not publicly disclosed. Or she made careful notes in a notebook she kept in the inner pocket of her coat. On the 31st day, she called her former university roommate, Liao Jing. Liao Jing was 3 years into an estate law practice at a firm in Chengdu's business district. She was not yet a partner. She was not yet well known. She was, however, precise and methodical and possessed of a willingness to work on unconventional problems that the larger firms had trained out of their associates. Shen Yao had liked her very much in her previous life and had allowed the friendship to lapse after the marriage, partly through neglect, and partly because Madame Jiang had an instinct for identifying the relationships in Shen Yao's life that did not serve the Jiang family's interests, and a talent for allowing them to erode through small strategic discouragements. She would not allow that erosion again. They met for coffee near Liao Jing's office, a place that served coffee in paper cups and had tables that wobbled on uneven legs, and a window that looked out onto the bus interchange where the diesel exhaust created a permanent haze. Shen Yao wrapped her hands around the cup and laid out a hypothetical. If a family gifted a jewelry collection to a daughter-in-law during the marriage, she said, and the daughter-in-law later discovered that the collection had been appraised fraudulently for the purposes of divorce proceedings, then what would the legal exposure look like? Liao Jing looked at her over her own coffee cup with the slightly narrowed gaze of someone calibrating the distance between a hypothetical and a real question. For whom? For the family. Specifically for the party who engaged the fraudulent appraiser. Criminal exposure would depend on whether you could prove the intent. Falsifying an appraisal report for use in judicial proceedings is fraud upon the court. That is not civil. Yeah, that is criminal. Liao Jing set her cup down. But you'd need documentary evidence, the appraiser's financial relationship with the family, communications, something. What about the collection itself? If it were later proven that the items appraised as genuine were actually reproductions, costume pieces, and the family had known this when they made the gift. Liao Jing was quiet for a moment. That depends on the purpose of the gift and the knowledge at the time. If the family knowingly gifted fake jewelry as genuine, that's a different kind of fraud. Not fraud upon the court, but fraud upon the recipient. Potentially unjust enrichment if they benefited from the false valuation. They would benefit in a divorce proceeding, Shen Yao said, if a collection they knew was worthless had been fraudulently valued at 28 million, and the wife was forced to either return it or pay half its assessed value. The family would recover assets that had no real value to anyone while eliminating the wife's financial position. Liao Jing picked up her cup again. That's not a hypothetical, is it? Not entirely. Is this already in litigation? Not yet. I'm in the preventive phase. You want to build the case before the event occurs. I want to understand the landscape, Shen Yao said, so that when the event occurs, I'm not standing in it without a map. Liao Jing was quiet for another moment, looking out at the bus interchange. A number 58 bus pulled in and released a crowd of passengers into the haze. I can't formally advise you on a case that doesn't exist yet, she said. But hypothetically, the most valuable thing in a situation like that would be an independent appraisal, done early, documented thoroughly, with a professional who has no connection to either party and whose credentials are bulletproof. And if that independent appraisal showed the collection was worthless, then you'd have the foundation of everything. Liao Jing looked at her. The question would be what you wanted to build on it. Shen Yao took a sip of her coffee. It was bad coffee. Slightly bitter and under-extracted, the kind that comes from a machine that is cleaned once a week by someone who considers cleaning it a bureaucratic obligation rather than a contribution to quality. I want to build something that doesn't fall down, she said. She met Jiang Mingze on the 42nd day, as scheduled by the logic of her previous life. The Yuehai Charity Gala was held in the ballroom of a hotel in the Gaoxin district, a room that smelled of cut flowers, and the particular warmth of a large crowd in formal clothing, wool and silk, and the various synthetic blends that aspired to silk. The lighting was warm and directional, the kind designed to make the attendees look their best, softening the lines of older faces and deepening the color of the younger ones. Shen Yao wore a dress she had bought secondhand from a consignment shop in the Chungxi Road area, navy blue and architecturally simple, cut in a way that suggested considerable restraint. She had done her own hair. She had a glass of sparkling water she was nursing with the practiced ease of someone who did not need to drink to be comfortable in a room. Jiang Mingze appeared at her shoulder at 8:47 in the evening, precisely as he had in her previous life, carrying a glass of Bordeaux. In her previous life, she had turned and found him beautiful and been grateful for the intrusion. She remembered the exact quality of that gratitude. The slight quickening, the automatic calculation of who he might be, followed by the warm surprise when he said his name. She turned now and looked at him with the calm attention of someone who has already read the entire script. He was, she acknowledged without effect, objectively good-looking, tall, with the kind of physical ease that comes from a lifetime of being accommodated, the ease of a body that has never been required to make itself smaller. His face was well-proportioned. His suit was a dark charcoal that fit with the precision of something made specifically for him. He was smiling the smile she now recognized as practiced. "You looked as though you'd prefer sparkling water," he said, nodding at her glass. "But I brought this anyway, in case you wanted options." In her previous life, she had laughed at that. She had found it charming. The small presumption of it, the way it implied he had been watching her long enough to have a preference. She looked at the glass of Bordeaux in his extended hand and then back at his face. "Thank you," she said, "but I actually do prefer sparkling water." She watched the small recalibration behind his eyes. He was accustomed to the laugh. He had used this opener before, and it had produced the laugh reliably. Its failure now produced a brief uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, she could see the mechanism, the way a practiced charm depended on the responses of its audience to sustain itself. "Jiang Mingze," he said, extending his hand instead. "Shen Yao." She shook it. Her grip was firm and brief. "You work in finance?" he said. Not a question. He had been briefed about her or had asked someone before approaching. That was information. "Junior analyst at Runjing Capital," she said. "You're with the Jiang Group." "Second generation," he said. So with a self-deprecating tilt of his head that she now understood was also practiced. The performed modesty of someone who wanted you to disagree. She did not disagree. She nodded once as though confirming a fact, and returned her attention to the stage where a local official was beginning remarks about the evening's charitable cause. He stayed beside her. In her previous life, that had felt like pursuit. She understood now that it was the behavior of a man who was not accustomed to indifference and found it interesting in the way of novelties, things that were interesting precisely because they were unusual, and would presumably become familiar with sufficient application of attention. She let him be interested. She was not cold to him, not visibly, she was simply contained. She answered his questions in the way of someone who has been well briefed on how to give precisely enough information to sustain a conversation without offering an opening. When the gala ended and he asked for her phone number, she gave it to him. She had always been going to give it to him. She needed to be inside the house. The courtship took 9 months in her previous life. It took 7 in this one because Shen Yao did not waste time being confused about what she wanted. She was not performing disinterest to increase his investment, the way some women managed romantic relationships as though they were market positions. She was genuinely uninterested in performing anything for Jiang Mingze. She was interested in the access his family represented, and she found him occasionally pleasant company in the way that someone can be pleasant company without being particularly significant. The way a comfortable chair can be a feature of a room without being the reason you are in it. He interpreted her quality of attention as depth. He told her once, in the 5th month, that she was the most interesting person he had ever dated. She had asked him what he meant by interesting, and he had said, "You're not always trying to be something." She had found that observation accurate, but had not said so. She met Madame Zhang in month 3, or earlier than in her previous life, because she arranged it rather than waiting for it to be arranged. "I'd like to meet your mother," she told Mingze on a Sunday evening when they were eating at a restaurant near his apartment, a place that served Cantonese food with sufficient care that the hargao arrived still properly steamed. "I think it's strange to be serious about a person without knowing the people who formed them." Mingze had looked at her across the table with an expression she now recognized as the particular look of a man who found himself slightly off balance in a relationship he thought he controlled. "She can be difficult," he said. "Most interesting people can." He had laughed, and in that laugh she had heard the beginning of the thing that had always been true about Jiang Mingze. Something she had missed in her first life because she had been too close to it. He was a man who wanted to be managed. He wanted a woman who would take the difficult decisions out of his hands while allowing him to believe he was making them. He had found that woman in his mother for 30 years, and he had been looking for someone who could assume part of that function without the complication of a maternal relationship. Shen Yao had fit the shape precisely. The difference now was that she understood the shape. Madame Zhang received her in the formal sitting room of the family's house in the Wuhu district, a house that was not ostentatious from the outside, but opened inward onto a series of rooms that had been furnished with the accumulated weight of 3 decades of selective acquisition. There were scroll paintings on the walls that were probably genuine. There were lacquered cabinets that were definitely antique. The tea service was porcelain with a delicate pattern that Shen Yao recognized from her previous life as a set Madame Zhang had described as coming from Jingdezhen during the Republican period. Madame Zhang was smaller than Shen Yao remembered. Or perhaps Shen Yao had grown into a different relationship with her own physical presence, and the memory of intimidation had inflated Madame Zhang's stature in retrospect. She was a slight woman in her late 50s, dressed in a silk blouse the color of pale ash, with hair that was almost entirely white and cut close in a way that suited the structure of her face. Her eyes were dark and very attentive. "Mingzi tells me you work in finance," she said, pouring tea with hands that were steady and precise. "Junior analyst, valuations and due diligence primarily." Due diligence. Madame Jiang handed her a cup. "A useful skill for a wife." "Useful for almost anyone," Shen Yao said. A small pause. A recalibration that Shen Yao recognized, the same recalibration she had seen in Mingzi's face at the gala. Madame Jiang was accustomed to prospective daughters-in-law who were eager to please. Shen Yao's lack of visible eagerness was registering as interesting in precisely the same way her lack of visible eagerness had registered with Mingzi. It was not a strategy. It was simply true. She was not eager to please Madame Jiang. She was here to understand her. Mingzi's father died when he was 17, Madame Jiang said. He required significant management after that. He still does. She picked up her own cup. The woman who can manage him well will find the position rewarding. "I'm not particularly interested in management as its own end," Shen Yao said. "I'm interested in building something. If that requires managing some of the conditions around it, that's incidental." Madame Zhang looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want to build?" Shen Yao met her eyes. "Something that holds." The first meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Shen Yao left, Madame Zhang walked her to the front gate of the house, which she had not done for any of Mingzi's previous partners, a fact Shen Yao knew because Mingzi had mentioned it to her that evening with a transparency that suggested he found it meaningful. Shen Yao filed the detail and moved forward. The wedding was in May of the following year. So small by the Zhang family's social standards, 200 guests held in the garden of the Wuhu house and a small hotel nearby. The day was warm and the jasmine that lined the garden wall had come into bloom, and the smell of it was thick and slightly sweet. Shen Yao wore a qipao and ivory silk for the ceremony and changed into a Western-style dress for the reception, both choices having been made with Madame Zhang's input. Because Madame Zhang had opinions about clothing, and Shen Yao had let her express them. Her paternal aunt had flown in from Guangzhou. She stood in the receiving line with the expression of someone who was happy but slightly overwhelmed. A woman who had worried about her orphaned niece for years and was now watching her marry into a family with a house worth 20 million. Shen Yao had hugged her and meant it. Mingzi was attentive on the wedding day, in the way of men who are performing the best version of themselves for an audience. He looked at her across the garden with an expression that she recognized as genuine feeling, or at least as the sincere conviction that he was experiencing genuine feeling. She did not fault him for the gap between the two. It was a gap she suspected he was not aware of. Most people were not aware of that gap in themselves. She settled into the marriage with the focused attention of someone executing a long-horizon plan. She did not resist Madame Zhang's influence over the household. She did not compete with it. She learned the structure from inside. The way the finances of the household operated, which expenses flowed through which accounts, who made the decisions about the house staff, and the social calendar, and the management of Mingzi's public appearances. She was helpful in ways that positioned her as capable without making Madame Zhang feel displaced. She was patient in ways that built Madame Zhang's trust. She did this not out of affection, not now, but out of the professional discipline of someone who understood that the most valuable asset in this environment was the appearance of alignment. She also, 3 months after the wedding, quietly resumed contact with Liao Jing. Not through Mingzi's phone or any account connected to the Jiang household network. She used a secondary phone she kept in her office at the Runjing capital office, where she had negotiated, as a condition of the marriage, to continue working part-time. Madame Jiang had been mildly resistant to this. The wives of the Jiang family did not hold external positions as a rule. Shen Yao had handled this by framing it not as independence, but as the continuation of a professional reputation that would be useful to the family. The Jiang name in finance circles benefits from having a family member who is respected in those circles, she had said to Madame Jiang during one of their afternoon tea sessions. An in-house perspective without the liability of a direct board seat. Madame Jiang had considered this with the particular expression of someone balancing their instinct for control against the logic of a good argument. The argument had won. Shen Yao had been permitted to continue working 2 days a week. Those 2 days were when she did her real work. She engaged Liao Jing on a retainer that she paid from a personal account she maintained under a financial institution the Jiang family did not use. The account had been opened before the marriage and was documented as existing prior to the marital estate, which meant it was personal property under the property law regime Shen Yao had reviewed carefully with Liao Jing before the wedding. The first task she gave Liao Jing was a comprehensive review of the publicly available information on the Jiayang Group's asset structure, specifically the holding entities she had identified in the land registry research the previous year. She wanted Liao Jing to build a map, not for immediate use, for orientation. The second task was to identify a certified estate appraiser with no professional or financial connection to the Jiang family or any of its known associates. Someone whose credentials were unimpeachable, someone who could, if needed, testify in court with the authority of a career built entirely independently. Liao Jing found him in the 8th month of the marriage. His name was Master Xue Dingwan, a man in his late 60s who had built a practice over 40 years appraising antique jewelry, traditional goldsmithing, and estate collections for private clients, law firms, and the courts. He had testified as an expert witness in 14 cases. He had been retained by neither the Jiamayang family nor any firm connected to them. His reputation in the field was, Liao Jing reported, immaculate. Shen Yao noted his contact information and waited. She did not have to wait long. Madame Jiang's health had begun to decline in the previous autumn, a respiratory condition that had been manageable for several years but was now progressing. By the first winter of the marriage, she was spending more time at home. And there was a quality in the way she moved through the house that Shen Yao recognized as the careful economy of someone managing pain. She had seen it before. She knew what it meant. She was not unmoved by it. That was the part she had not fully anticipated, sitting in the hospital at 23, cataloging what she needed to do. She had assumed she could maintain clean emotional separation. She had been wrong. Not because Madame Jiang's warmth had penetrated her defenses as it had in the first life, but because illness was hard to watch with perfect indifference regardless of the context. Watching a person become smaller, watching the deliberate movements and the careful management of breath was difficult independent of what you thought of that person. She sat with Madame Jiang in the afternoons when she was home. She brought tea. She listened to stories about Ming's father and about the early years of the Jiang Group and about the house in Chengdu where Madame Jiang had grown up, a house that no longer existed, replaced by an office building. She did not perform fondness, but she did not have to perform attention. The stories were genuinely interesting, and the woman telling them was genuinely complex. And Shen Yao had never been someone who could not appreciate complexity even when it was wrapped in antagonism. The jewelry collection appeared on a Thursday in the 3rd winter of the marriage. Madame Jiang called her to the private sitting room, the same room where it had happened in her previous life, and the velvet-lined case was already open on the low table. 41 pieces. Shen Yao had been waiting for this for 3 years, and still the sight of it produced something in her chest that was not exactly anticipation and was not exactly dread. It was the sensation of a plan advancing into its primary phase. She sat down across from Madame Jiang and looked at the collection. "These belong to my mother," Madame Jiang said, "and her mother before her, and several pieces I acquired myself over the years." She touched the oval set ring with one finger, the ring with the deep green stone, the one Shen Yao had admired in her previous life. "This one I bought in Shanghai in 1988. I was 26. I had saved for 2 years. Shen Yao said nothing. She was looking at the pieces with her professional eye. The eye she had spent the last 3 years sharpening through reading and consultation, and the careful accumulation of knowledge in a field adjacent to her work. She was looking at the settings, the prong work, the weight of the pieces in the velvet, the way they sat, the quality of light they returned. What she saw was what she had been expecting to see, though the seeing of it still required a moment of careful neutrality before she could continue. The settings were good quality, but they were not old. The patina on several pieces was applied, not accumulated. The stones in the ring with the deep green setting had a clarity and regularity that natural emerald almost never achieved. "I want you to have it," Madame Jiang said. "A woman should have something that belongs only to her." The same words, the same cadence. Shen Yao wondered whether Madame Jiang used this line deliberately, a prepared formulation, or whether it arose naturally from her understanding of how the gift should be framed. She had thought about this question for 3 years, and still did not have an answer. It was one of the few questions about this situation that she had not been able to resolve. "This is a significant gift," Shen Yao said. Her voice was warm. She had practiced warm without grateful because grateful was the response of someone who was overwhelmed, and she was not overwhelmed. She was continuing. "It is what you deserve," Madame Jiang said. And then, "Keep it carefully. It is the most valuable thing I have to give." Shen Yao met her eyes. "I will treat it with the seriousness it deserves," she said. She carried the case home that evening in both hands. She called Master Xue Dingyuan the next morning. He received her at his studio 2 days later, on the second floor of a building in the Qingyang district that smelled of metal polish and the particular dryness of a space where the air was carefully controlled for preservation. The studio was small and extraordinarily organized, tools arranged with the precision of someone who thought of arrangement as part of the work. There were magnifying instruments and calibration equipment, and a light table and several reference books whose spines showed the wear of regular consultation. Master Xie was a small man, with very steady hands and bifocal lenses that magnified his eyes into something owlish and attentive. He gestured for Shen Yao to set the case on his work surface, and then positioned the lamp and reached for a loupe. He worked in silence. Shen Yao stood to the side and watched him work through each piece systematically, handling each item with the brief, confident touch of someone who has handled thousands of comparable items and can categorize what they feel before they have consciously registered the sensation. He was unhurried. He spent additional time on the oval ring and on 2 of the necklaces. He used a small instrument she recognized as a thermal conductivity tester, running it across the surface of the green stone in the ring. He worked for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he set down the last piece and removed his loupe and folded his hands on the work surface and looked at her. "These are all costume," he said. His voice was measured, not apologetic and not dramatic. He said it the way he would say anything else, as a technical finding delivered to a client. "All 41 pieces? All 41. The metals are alloy, primarily brass with a gold plating treatment on the yellow pieces. The plating is good quality, industrial grade, not costume store grade, which is why they present reasonably well to an untrained eye. The stones are synthetic and glass. The green stone in the ring is synthetic spinel, not emerald." He looked at the pieces in the open case. The overall collection has some value as vintage costume. The workmanship is above average, and several pieces date to the 1970s or 1980s based on the construction style. As a collection, I would estimate 40,000 to 60,000 RMB. As individual items at a vintage market, perhaps slightly more for a few pieces. "Not 28 million, Shen Yao said. Master Xue looked at her. It was the first indication she had given him that she had a prior number in mind. "Not remotely," he said. "Could an experienced appraiser mistake these for genuine?" A pause. "A grossly negligent one, possibly?" "A fraudulent one, certainly." He looked at her steadily. "If you are asking whether a competent, ethical appraiser could arrive at a valuation of 28 million RMB for this collection, the answer is no. It is not possible." Shen Yao looked at the collection for a moment. The oval ring was sitting in the center of the case, the synthetic spinel catching the light of Master Xue's work lamp and returning it with the even, identical consistency of something manufactured. Natural stones were never that consistent. They always had variation, inclusions, the small irregularities of something that had formed underground under pressure over millions of years. This stone was flawless in the way of things that had never been underground, had never been anywhere except a factory. "I'll need a written report," she said. "Your full credentials, your methodology, your findings on each piece, and a total valuation. On your official letterhead." Yeah, dated and signed. "Standard for court-grade documentation?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer. "This is not the first time I have done this kind of work," he said. "I know. That's why you're here." She gave Liao Jing a copy of the report the following week. Liao Jing read it at her desk, and then set it down and picked up her coffee and looked at the wall for a moment, a brief processing pause that was one of her characteristic habits. Then she said, "The 28 million valuation. Who gave it?" "An appraiser named Liu Pengfei. He was retained by the Jiang family's legal team during what would have been the divorce proceedings." Shen Yao had said would have been because they had not yet occurred. Liao Jing had stopped questioning the temporal logic of Shen Yao's information some months ago. She was a practical woman. "You have his name and his prior connection to the family's legal team. That's a starting point." Liao Jing set down her coffee. "Well, what are you doing with this?" "I'm building something," Shen Yao said. "The jewelry is one piece of it." "What's the larger picture?" Shen Yao had thought carefully about what to tell Liao Jing and about when. Liao Jing was trustworthy and competent, but she was also an officer of the court, and there were things Shen Yao was doing and planning to do that existed at the edge of what Liao Jing would be comfortable knowing in advance. Not illegal, or she was not interested in doing anything illegal, but aggressive in a way that required the confidence of someone who had already seen it work, and that confidence was not always communicable to someone who had not. "The Jiang Group has been using related party property transfers to move assets into holding entities whose beneficial ownership is obscured," she said. "The transfers are undervalued, which means they're paying below-market purchase prices, which means there's a tax efficiency benefit that may not have been properly disclosed. Some of the entities involved were incorporated under the old regime and have never been updated to comply with current beneficial ownership transparency requirements." Liao Jing was looking at her with the attentiveness of someone who was recalibrating an assessment. "You've been sitting on this." "I've been gathering." "How long?" "Since before the marriage." Another processing pause. "Shen Yao, what exactly are you planning to do?" "I'm planning to file a comprehensive report with the Financial Crimes Unit," Shen Yao said. "Not immediately, at the right moment. With the jewelry valuation fraud as a supporting element, demonstrating a pattern of fraudulent financial representations rather than an isolated incident. The jewelry fraud and the asset structuring are separate matters. They are both representations of the same thing, which is a family that has made a practice of misrepresenting the value of its assets for financial advantage. The jewelry fraud is smaller and more personal. The asset structuring is larger and more systemic. Together, they tell a story that is more credible than either one alone." Liao Jing was quiet for a long time. She picked up the Master Xie report and looked at it again. "If you file this report before the divorce, the investigation will freeze assets. That will complicate your position as a spouse." "I know." "You'll need to have secured your own financial position before you pull the trigger." "I know." "What's your timeline?" Shen Yao looked at the wall above Liao Jing's desk, where there was a framed character that meant something about persistence or endurance or the dignified continuation of effort. She had always liked it. "I need approximately 8 more months," she said. Those 8 months were the most demanding of her professional life. She continued to fulfill every expectation of a Jiang family daughter-in-law. She attended the social obligations. She managed Ming's schedule with the quiet competence he had come to rely on. She sat with Madame Jiang in the afternoons. She was present and attentive, and gave no visible indication of anything except a woman growing into her position. And in the 2 days a week at her office, and in the hours after Mingze fell asleep, she worked. She had, in the months before the jewelry collection transfer, begun quietly purchasing shares in 3 companies that were publicly traded but had a significant portion of their capital structure intertwined with the Jiang Group's network of related party transactions. She was not buying Jung Group shares, which would have been visible and complicated. She was buying positions in the secondary ecosystem, the building materials supplier that held a long-term contract with several Jung Group development projects, the property management firm that handled 3 of the Jung Group's commercial assets, a logistics company that had grown substantially on the back of Jung Group business. These were not insider trades. She had no material, non-public information about these companies' own financials. But she had a professional understanding of the Jung Group's asset structure that gave her a clearer picture than the average market participant of how those companies would be affected by various scenarios. She was building a position that would appreciate in a stable environment and could be liquidated cleanly in an unstable one. She also, in month 6 of the 8, made a discovery that required her to revise her understanding of the situation upward in both its complexity and its severity. She'd been reviewing the land registry transfers she had first identified in the library 2 years earlier, updating her analysis with more recent filings. One of the holding entities, a company incorporated in 1994 under the name Chungyuan Properties, had made a new acquisition in the previous quarter. A commercial parcel in Chengdu's high-tech zone, purchased at a price that was 40% below the assessed value. The assessed value was a number she recognized. It was the same parcel that appeared in a financing document she had reviewed as part of the Jiang Group's public bond issuance from 18 months prior. In that document, the parcel had been listed as collateral at its full assessed value. It had been sold to Chungyuan Properties 4 months after the bond was issued. The collateral had been transferred out of the entity that had pledged it after the bond was already in market, at a price that grossly understated its value. So to a holding company whose beneficial ownership was not disclosed. This was not a tax efficiency strategy. This was fraud against bondholders. Shen Yao sat in her office with the documents spread across her desk for a long time. The office was quiet. The building was mostly empty at the hour she worked, late enough that the cleaning crew had finished and early enough that the morning arrivals had not yet begun. The fluorescent light above her desk had a very slight flicker that she had reported to building management 3 weeks ago and that had not been addressed. She was not surprised by what she had found. She was not shocked or disgusted, not in a way that required processing. What she was very clear. What she had found was not something that could be included in a comprehensive financial crimes report. It was something that required its own reporting through a different channel to a different authority. The China Securities Regulatory Commission had a dedicated unit for exactly this kind of fraud. She called Liao Jing in the morning and told her what she had found. Liao Jing's voice, over the phone, had a particular quality that Shen Yao had come to associate with the moments when Liao Jing was internally adjusting her assessment of a situation's magnitude, a brief tightening of breath, a half-second of silence before she spoke. "You're certain," she said. "The documents are clear. If this is what you're describing, the exposure for the Jung Group goes well beyond a civil divorce matter. Yes, this is a criminal securities fraud investigation. It will be when I report it." A longer silence. "When are you going to tell me everything?" Liao Jing said. Shen Yao looked at the flickering fluorescent light. "I need 4 more weeks," she said. "Then I'll tell you everything." In week 3 of those 4 weeks, Bai Feifei appeared. Shen Yao had not known exactly when this would happen, only that it would. She had not known the name in her previous life until the divorce proceedings, when Bai Feifei had been called as a witness to confirm the timeline of her relationship with Mingze. Shen Yao had sat in the courtroom and listened to the testimony of a woman she had never seen before describe, in procedural terms, the years she had spent with Shen Yao's husband, and she had felt something that had no precise name. So, a compound of betrayal and fury, and the cold humiliation of having been the last to know. She already knew. She did not know Bai Feifei's name yet, or her face, but she knew the shape of what was happening. She had noticed it in small things over the preceding months, the direction of Mingze's attention shifting inward rather than outward, the quality of his distraction, the slight reduction in the transparency he had always offered her, never complete transparency. Or but a kind of daily report of his emotional state that had now become intermittent. She had noticed without reacting because she had been expecting it, and because reacting was not part of her plan. She found out the name through a method she was not entirely comfortable with, which was asking Ming's driver, a man who had worked for the family for 12 years and who had a daughter with a congenital heart condition for whom the family had provided medical assistance, in that indirect way that created loyalty without making the loyalty explicit. The driver was not a spy. He was simply a man who was aware of what he had observed in the course of his work and who, when Shen Yao asked him a direct and kind-voiced question about whether he had noticed anything concerning, answered honestly. Bai Feifei, 28 years old, worked in marketing at a consumer goods company in the Wuhu district, had been seeing Mingzi for approximately 9 months. Shen Yao thanked the driver and told him she would not need him to mention the conversation to anyone. She spent one evening doing a thorough professional and personal review of Bai Feifei, not from spite but because she needed to understand the dynamics she was operating in. She found a woman who was by all indicators reasonably intelligent and reasonably ambitious, and who had been unlucky in the specific way of women who attach their ambitions to men who are ultimately invested only in the convenience of the attachment. She was not Shen Yao's enemy. She was a participant in a situation she probably understood less fully than she believed. Shen Yao filed the information and moved forward. She did not confront Mingzi. She did not allow any visible change in their household dynamic. She managed him as she had been managing him, with the steady competence that had made their marriage function, and he responded as he always had, with the slightly guilty over-attentiveness of a man who was compensating for something he had not been caught doing. She was not interested in catching him. She was interested in timing. The timing arrived in the form of Madame Jiang's health. In week 4 of the final 4 weeks, Madame Jiang was admitted to the hospital with a significant deterioration of her respiratory condition. The prognosis, which the doctor delivered to Mingzi and Shen Yao in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and the hospital's particular brand of institutional coffee, was not optimistic. They were looking at a matter of months rather than years, management rather than recovery, comfort rather than cure. Mingzi took this information with the fragile composure of a man who had been managing his awareness of it for a long time and found that being told directly still required a recalibration. He was quiet on the drive home. Shen Yao sat beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not be either false comfort or a manipulation she was not willing to perform. At home, he went directly to his study and closed the door. She heard him on the phone within 20 minutes. She did not try to hear what he was saying. She already knew who he was calling. She went upstairs and sat at her desk and opened the documents she had been preparing and began to review them for the last time. She had 4 documents. The first was a comprehensive report addressed to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Unit of the Ministry of Public Security, detailing the Jiang Group's related party asset transfers, the undervaluation pattern, the obscured beneficial ownership of the receiving entities, and the evidence trail she had assembled over the preceding years. The report was 47 pages. It had been reviewed by Liao Jing and by a second lawyer she had consulted specifically on financial crimes procedure. It contained 23 annexes, including land registry documents, corporate registration records, transaction comparables from the same periods demonstrating the market rate for similar properties, and a financial analysis demonstrating the aggregate magnitude of the undervaluation. The second was a separate report addressed to the China Securities Regulatory Commission detailing the collateral fraud in the bond issuance. This one was 28 pages. It was more focused and more severe because the securities fraud was a cleaner case, the evidence was more direct, and the regulatory framework for this kind of violation was well established and actively enforced. The third was a filing with the civil court requesting an independent investigation into the jewelry appraisal conducted by Liu Pengfei in connection with anticipated divorce proceedings. This one had not been filed yet because there were no divorce proceedings yet. It was prepared and dated and ready. The fourth was a petition drafted by Liao Jing and reviewed by the second lawyer, requesting the court to rule that the jewelry collection gifted by Jiayang Yulan to Shen Yao constituted not a marital asset, but a documented fraud upon the recipient, on the grounds that the collection had been represented as genuine estate jewelry when it was demonstrably costume, and that its subsequent fraudulent appraisal during divorce proceedings constituted an attempt to weaponize the fraud against the person defrauded. You see, this fourth document was the one Shen Yao had thought about most carefully, because it was the most personal and the most complex. It required the court to make a finding not just about the value of the jewelry, but about Madame Jiang's intent when she made the gift. That intent, Shen Yao believed, was knowable from the evidence, but was not provable beyond doubt. What was provable was the fraud. The intent was an inference. She had decided that the inference was not necessary to her goals and had removed it from the petition. What the petition argued was simpler. The collection was worthless. The appraisal that had valued it at $28 million was fraudulent, and therefore no marital asset claim based on that appraisal could stand. The question of why the collection was fake was a separate inquiry for other parties. She filed the first 2 documents electronically at 9:43 in the evening through the dedicated secure portals of the relevant agencies. The Financial Crimes Report carried the case number her previous submission had generated when she had filed a preliminary notice of intent 3 months earlier. The CSRC report was new. She put the 3rd and 4th documents into a file folder in her desk drawer. Then she went downstairs and made herself a cup of tea. Not the formal tea that she made for Madame Jiang or for Mingze on the occasions when he wanted the performance of domesticity. She made herself cheap green tea from a bag, in a mug she had bought from a street vendor near her old apartment in Jinjiang, a plain white mug with a small chip on the handle that she had kept because she found the imperfection honest. She stood at the kitchen window with the mug and looked out at the garden. The jasmine had been cut back for winter. The garden was dark except for the security lighting, which gave the bare branches of the decorative plum tree a quality that was almost architectural, all structure and no softness. She had stood at this window many times over the past 3 years. In the beginning, when the marriage was new and she was still orienting to the geography of this life, she had stood here and reminded herself why she was there. Later, she had stood here on evenings when the plan had required waiting, and she was practicing patience. Now she was standing here having just set something in motion that could not be recalled. She felt very quietly the specific relief of a decision irrevocably made. The investigations moved at the pace of institutional machinery, which is to say faster in the first stage than anyone expects, and then considerably slower in the middle stages than anyone hopes. The CSRC responded within 2 weeks with a formal acknowledgement of receipt and an indication that the report had been referred to the Enforcement Division. The Financial Crimes Unit acknowledged receipt of the comprehensive report within a month. Shen Yao told Mingze nothing. She continued their life with the same steady competence she had maintained for 3 years. She visited Madame Jiang in the hospital twice a week and sat with her in the afternoons when the light was good. He and Madame Jiang talked sometimes and was quiet sometimes, and once, on a gray afternoon in November, held Shen Yao's hand without speaking for almost an hour. Shen Yao held her hand back and did not look at her watch. There was a quality in those hospital visits that she had not planned for and could not fully categorize. Not forgiveness. She was not interested in a narrative of forgiveness. It was a word that implied an arc of suffering and resolution that she had decided to bypass. Though not affection exactly, though there was something present that was not entirely impersonal. Perhaps it was the recognition of a complicated person coming to the end of a life that had not been simple, and the understanding that the complications were not reducible to their worst elements, even when their worst elements had been significant. Madame Jiang had built something over 60 years, in a country and a context and a set of expectations that had not made building easy for a woman of her generation. She had held a family together and a business structure together and a social position together. She had done it through intelligence and will, and a willingness to make strategic decisions that were not always ethical. That was true, and also not the whole truth, and Shen Yao was old enough now, or experienced enough, to hold both things without needing one of them to be wrong. She was also old enough to know that the holding of both things did not change what she was doing. Mingze told her about Bai Feifei on a Tuesday in February. He did it in the kitchen, which was an interesting choice that Shen Yao suspected was unconscious. The domestic space as a de-escalation, the room associated with ordinary activities offering a kind of dilution of the severity of what he was about to say. He stood on the other side of the island counter with his hands flat on the surface and told her in a voice that was rehearsed and also genuinely uncomfortable that there was someone else and had been for some time, and that he thought they should talk about where they went from here. Shen Yao was holding her mug of tea. She had been about to sit down at the kitchen table with a document she was reviewing. She set the mug down on the counter and looked at him for a moment with the calm attention she always gave him when he was saying something that required a decision. "How long?" she said. "About 18 months. He said this with the slightly pinched quality of someone who knows the length of time does not help his case. "By Fei Fei," she said. His expression shifted in a way that was almost comical before he controlled it. "How do you know her name?" "I know a great deal," Shen Yao said. "We can talk about where we go from here. I have no interest in contesting the end of this marriage." She picked up her mug again. "My lawyer will be in contact with yours this week." The divorce proceedings were, compared to what they had been in her previous life, extraordinarily straightforward. Liao Jing filed the civil petition regarding the jewelry collection, which produced the expected response from the Jiang family's lawyers, who produced the expected appraisal by Liu Pengfei valuing the collection at 28 million. Liao Jing produced Master Xue Dingwan's report, his credentials, and his documented methodology. She filed a motion for the court to appoint its own independent appraiser. The court appointed 2 independent appraisers, both of whom confirmed Master Xu's findings within weeks of each other. The Jiayang family's lawyers requested additional time to prepare a response. The judge granted 2 weeks. Liu Pengfei's connection to the Jiayang family's legal team was by that point a matter of record in the petition. A cross-reference with the financial crimes investigation, which had moved into a preliminary examination phase, had surfaced several other instances of Liu Pengfei providing appraisal services for entities connected to the Jiang Group in transactions that had subsequently attracted regulatory interest. He had retained a criminal defense lawyer. The jewelry collection was removed from the marital asset calculation entirely. It was assessed at 55,000 RMB as vintage costume, consistent with Master Xu's valuation, and allocated to Shen Yao as personal property on the grounds that she had been the recipient of the gift and the defrauded party in the subsequent valuation. The Jiang family's lawyers did not contest this. The marital asset division was completed without reference to the jewelry, and Shen Yao's financial position, which included the personal account established before the marriage and the investment positions she had built over 3 years, was fully protected as personal property predating the marital estate. She walked out of the final hearing on a Thursday afternoon in April. The building had the smell of institutional space, tile, and cleaning products, and the slight staleness of air that moved through a ventilation system that was older than it should have been. She stood on the steps outside and looked at the street. It was a warm afternoon. The magnolia trees along the boulevard were in early bloom, large white flowers against the gray-white sky, substantial and temporary in the way of magnolia flowers that were always too brief for the size of the promise they made. Liao Jing came out behind her and stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "The CSRC enforcement action is going to be public within the quarter. The financial crimes preliminary examination is expected to escalate in the summer." "I know. The Jiang Group's bond price has already moved. The market knows something is coming." "Yes." "Your positions in the secondary companies," Liao Jing said, with the careful tone of someone choosing their words for precision. "The ones you established before any of this was in motion, those are going to perform well in the current environment, depending on how the investigation unfolds." Shen Yao looked at the magnolia trees. "Yes. I'm not going to ask. I didn't do anything illegal," Shen Yao said. "I used professional knowledge about a business structure I was legitimately embedded in to make investment decisions about entirely unrelated publicly traded companies. Every transaction was documented, dated, and executed through registered accounts. I had no material non-public information about the specific companies I bought positions in." She paused. "I was simply better informed about the broader landscape than most participants." Liao Jing was quiet. "That's a very careful sentence. I've had a long time to think about it." She called her aunt in Guangzhou that evening from the kitchen of the apartment she had moved into the previous month, a place in the Jinjiang district 3 blocks from her old rental, the one she had lived in before the marriage. It was not the same apartment. It was similar. High ceilings, a window that faced east, a kitchen that was genuinely small but organized well enough to function. Her aunt picked up on the 3rd ring. She sounded surprised and then warm, the specific warmth of someone who had worried for a long time and was now readjusting. "The divorce went through?" Shen Yao said. "I know. You told me it was today." "How are you feeling?" Shen Yao looked at the kitchen window, at the darkening evening outside it. A neighbor across the way had their light on, warm and yellow, and she could see the edge of a bookshelf and the back of a chair where someone was sitting. She did not know this neighbor. She had no particular feeling about them, but the light was the kind of light that was simply good to see. "I'm fine," she said. "Do you need anything?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." She leaned against the counter. "But I wanted to tell you that I'm thinking about opening my own practice. Valuations and financial forensics. I have some capital." A pause. "Your own practice," her aunt repeated. "Not another firm. No, my own." Her aunt was quiet for a moment. "What kind of cases?" "The kind where someone has been told something is worth nothing when it's worth something, or the other way around." She looked at the warm window across the way. Both directions." Her aunt made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "When did you become this person?" she said. Shenyao thought about the hospital ceiling with the water stain shaped like a spreading bruise, the hospital blanket, the smell of antiseptic and cheap pine, the library in Jinjiang where she had sat with her notes under fluorescent lighting, building a map of someone else's architecture. "I've been working on it for a while," she said. "Well," her aunt's voice was warm and slightly helpless, the voice of someone watching a relative do something beyond their comprehension but clearly within their competence. "Good." The CSRC enforcement action became public 11 weeks later. Shenyao heard about it in the way she heard about most things now, from her phone, in the kitchen, early in the morning, when the east-facing window was full of the particular quality of morning light that required no artificial supplement. The light of a city waking up that was not beautiful in any refined sense, but was real in a way that sustained her. The announcement was brief and formal, as these things were. The Jung Group was under investigation for alleged violations of securities law in connection with the collateral pledging practices associated with its 2021 bond issuance. Trading in the company's securities had been suspended pending preliminary findings. The relevant executives had been asked to remain available for questioning. She read it twice, not because she needed to read it twice, but because the first reading had produced something she wanted to be sure about. What she felt was not satisfaction in the heated sense, not the flush of a revenge achieved. What she felt was closer to the sensation she had described to Liao Jing years ago, the sensation of a plan that held. She set her phone face down on the counter. She filled the kettle. The kettle had a small residue of scale on the heating element. She had been meaning to run a vinegar cycle for 2 weeks and had not gotten to it. Small administrative failures were still part of life, and she had decided not to be annoyed by them. She made her tea. She had an 11 o'clock call with a new client, a woman who had been given her name by a mutual contact in the legal world. A client who had been told by a property developer that the apartment she had purchased off-plan was worth less than the deposit she had paid because the development had been reclassified in a way that affected its market value, and she wanted someone to look at the numbers and tell her whether that was true. Shenyao sat at her desk with her tea and opened the preliminary documents the client had sent her and began to read. She had been reading for about 4 minutes when her phone lit up with a message from Liao Jing. 2 words and nothing else. It held. Shenyao looked at the message for a moment. Then she put the phone face down and went back to the documents. There was work to do. 3 months after the enforcement action became public, at a conference on estate law and forensic valuation held at the Sichuan University of Science and Engineering, Shenyao gave a 45-minute presentation on the legal and evidentiary framework for challenging fraudulent asset valuations in marital proceedings. The room was medium-sized, capacity perhaps 200, about half filled with lawyers and forensic accountants and several academics. The smell was lecture hall, which is a specific smell of paper and dry air and the communal warmth of bodies. The lighting was overhead fluorescent, the kind that was honest rather than flattering. She spoke without notes. She had written out everything she wanted to say and then had not brought the notes because she knew it better than the notes did. She described the legal structure of asset valuation in divorce proceedings under Chinese civil law. She described the regulatory framework for challenging fraudulent appraisals. She walked through a hypothetical case, the structure of which anyone with knowledge of recent Chengdu legal matters could recognize if they cared to, involving a jewelry collection that was represented as genuine estate pieces, appraised by a paid expert at a value 500 times its actual worth, and used as leverage in a marital asset dispute. She described the methodological requirements for a counter-appraisal that would stand up to challenge in court. She described the evidentiary standard for proving fraud versus negligence in appraisal practice. She described the intersection between civil fraud claims in marital proceedings and the broader financial crimes regulatory framework when the same pattern of misrepresentation appeared in multiple contexts. She was precise and organized and not theatrical. She did not use her own name. She referred throughout to the spouse and the family and the appraiser in the neutral language of case study rather than narrative. When she finished, she opened the floor to questions. A woman in the second row, a civil litigator based on the card she had placed on the table in front of her, asked, "In the hypothetical case you described, how did the spouse know that the collection was fake before the family expected her to know?" Shenyao looked at her for a moment. "She got it appraised," she said, "on her own, before anyone else was looking." "That early?" "The moment she received it." "Why so early?" What prompted that?" Shenyao picked up her water glass from the podium and took a measured sip. The room was waiting, with the particular quality of rooms that sense something more personal than the technical framework of the lecture is about to be said. She set the glass down. "When someone gives you something and tells you it is the most valuable thing they have to give," she said, "it is worth taking a moment to verify what you've been given." She looked at the room steadily. Not out of suspicion, out of care. The things we protect are the things we understand. You cannot protect what you have not looked at clearly. She closed her laptop. "Thank you for your time," she said. She collected her notes, the notes she had not used, and walked off the stage and through the side door into the corridor, where the light was less managed, bare and fluorescent, and the smell was institutional, and it felt as institutional spaces always felt to her, like honest ground. Her phone showed a missed call from Liao Jing and a message from her new client in the apartment valuation matter. The developer had received the preliminary report she had submitted and was requesting an urgent meeting. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and walked to the elevator. The building's corridor was long and the elevator was slow. She stood and waited for it with her hands in her pockets and her weight evenly distributed. The posture of someone who has nowhere to be except the next thing and is entirely prepared for the next thing. The elevator arrived. She got in.
Fucking cold. You got this. That sounds yuck. It's 9 p.m. Yeah, cold. Late enough, early enough to be cold. Brother is also named Sky. I can periodically get tired of him. That is your familial right. You're absolutely correct. What's Croyken Boomers? Sorry, what's the play? Hey, just quickly, what's the playlist? Croyken Boomers. What the hell? Croyken Boomers. New stream title went Croyken Boomers. Croyken Boomers. It's you actually got very close. Matu, that was exactly it. Or actually, I guess Boomers. Has a lot of bass or a lot of Skinner, yeah. Creatable Sky. Greetings. Welcome in. Creatable. Thank you for the follow. Welcome. How you doing? How's your weekend? Croyken. Who up Croyken their boomers? Who up Croyken their boomers right now? Summoned. Oh my god, Sky. True. Wait. Creatable Sky. That's what I'm about to do. What the hell? That's freaky deaky. That's pretty cool. I don't know why it didn't save that list. Let's just shuffle this one, shall we? Let's see what we got here. Just a little vocal. No vocal. Who up Croyken their boomers? Okay, what is... Wow, Glenn's really just doing some ironing. Furiously Croyken.